Okay, welcome back. In this chapter, what we're going to do is basically an orientation, get you settled in on where the various windows are, how to get to the basic functional tools, and how to navigate through the system, as well as some basic window handling and so forth. So this is the default view of the window layout in Wavelab, and you have essentially three components here. This main area at the bottom is called the workspace window, and that's where you're going to do the majority of your work. And most of these windows, if you double-click the bar at the top, they'll maximize, and you can double-click it again to put it back where it was. So that is your workspace window. That's where you're going to do your work. That's where you're going to spend the bulk of your time. The surrounding windows here are called control windows, and just exactly as their name implies, they exist basically to help you control the work that you're doing in the workspace. And then your third section, or third window, is the master section over here to the right. And that's a fixed component in space. It's always there. Well, it's not actually fixed in space. You can drag it around and do stuff with it too. And we're going to get into that in the end of this video. But it's a fixed component in the workflow. The master section is always going to be part of every project. So what I'd like to do now is maximize the workspace window, and we'll take a little bit of time looking at it. And this layout is very cool, brand new in version 9, and essentially at the top you have the ribbon, as we discussed in the last chapter. And then below that you have an organizational structure called a file group. And this one that I've created is called the tour file group, and it has 7 things in it. It has 7 different workflows, one for each of the major categories of stuff that Wavelab does. So we have an audio file, and the montage, batch processor, a podcast, CD, DVD audio, and then a script. And a couple of things I want to point out. I'm going to tab through each one of these for you. And I want you to notice how the ribbon is going to modify itself based on what we've selected. So in the audio editor mode, the top of the workspace window actually takes the name of that workflow. It says audio editor. And then you have blue tabs at the top for your high-level functions, whether you're looking at different ways of viewing, editing, inserting, various processes. You've got analytics, and then your render functions. Now, within each of those, there's a sub-architecture. So if we look at the Edit tab, now look at the bottom of that tool window, or that tool strip, you can see you've got tools related to the source, the group they call tools, which is your selection stuff. You've got time selection, clipboard cutting, nudging, and snapping. And as I move to the insert process, same thing. We've got a subdivision down here for markers and audio file. And then in the process tab, leveling, normalizing, fading, etc. That basic architecture, the way those tabs are nested and organized, is common throughout all of Wavelab. And so let's go back to the View tab and move over to our next piece of work, which is an audio montage. And you'll notice that now we have a different selection of tabs. It didn't change a whole lot, but it added this envelope tab. Things like analyze and render stayed there. Whereas if we come over to the batch process, the only thing we have is an edit tab, and nothing in here looks the same now because Wavelab is presenting us with everything we need and nothing we don't. So it's giving us only the tools that apply to working with a batch processor. And coming to the podcast, same thing, and same the CD workspace. And we're going to go through an example of each one of these, so I don't want to linger too long in the nuts and bolts of all the tools in this overview section. But the point is that the ribbon is going to adapt dynamically to whatever you have selected, which is a really handy tool to keep stuff out of your way. Now, I want to pause here for just a second. This is a sample script. You wouldn't believe how long it took me to put just this together. The scripting thing is extremely advanced. It's certainly beyond me. I think it's beyond the majority of casual users, but so we don't do a disservice, I want to just take 10 seconds here and look at it. How this works is if you're proficient with this scripting language, you would type these series of commands in here, and then when you click the only button that you have in your ribbon, the execute script, it would run that program on whatever piece of audio you have selected. And so I think you would actually need to come in here and add specific values to define which wave you're talking about and so forth. But it can do highly specific stuff. So if you put together a script that says, I want you to find every AIFF file that's more than 2 minutes long and fade the beginning and the end out by 2 seconds at this slope. If your world involves having to do that set of operations over and over and over again, it's worth it to get in the books, figure out how to write the script for that, and then you select all your audio and then hit execute script, and it does it. And that's actually in some ways very similar to a batch process. The scripting side of it is creating a command to run over and over again, whereas batch processing is taking a whole group of files to execute one process on. But in any case, the scripting this is the only time in the whole video series we're going to talk about scripting, but that's basically how it is. You would select that and you would type the magic letters in here and then hit the one button, execute, and it would do that. And surprise, surprise, my random typing has a syntax error. Story of my life. But now let's go back. I'm going to click on the first tab again here. And what I want to show you here, just before we leave the focus on those tabs for a moment, I'm going to just grab some audio and copy it and drag it over there. We'll get into how to do that in the audio edit section. But what I want to point out is when I did that, look at the name for the first tab, Chapter 1 Layout. You'll notice an asterisk appeared. I'm going to hit Control-Z to undo that. The asterisk goes away. I'll make another change, and the asterisk is back. And what that's telling you, anytime you see an asterisk in one of those tabs, that's just a heads up that tab, whatever's on there, has somehow been edited but not saved. So that's just a key as to what's in work. And if we hit Control-S to save now, that's going to take that away. So that's what the asterisk means. You'll see that popping up all over Wavelab. It's a common nomenclature throughout the program, but that's the significance of that. So essentially, in the audio editor here, one of the first things that's if you've never used Wavelab before, the obvious question is why the two displays? I've got the same information twice. And it's really just like a built-in version of having two monitors. It's just two different ways to look at the same stuff. And that allows you to do some neat things like look at one in the spectrum view or in the loudness view while you're editing and making changes at the bottom in, say, the waveform view. So this is the sound over time, whereas this is the frequency over time and so forth, amplitude over time versus frequency over time and loudness and so on. Now there's an up-down arrow pair here that says sync. If you click that, it's going to bring the two into the same, it's going to lock them together at the same zoom level and so forth. And as you move one, they're going to slide back and forth together. And you can unhook them here and go back to your independent view. And you'll have a second set of arrows down below here. And if you use this arrow set, then the top one's going to link to the bottom, and the bottom becomes the controlling. So if we have this guy zoomed way out, we unhook him and zoom this guy way in. If we use the bottom sync arrow pair, the top one's going to match with it, and vice versa. So that's the basic deal with the double vision here. That's what that's all about. And we'll get into we have a whole chapter just on the audio editor that we'll be coming to shortly. Okay, next what I want to do is put away the audio editor and clarify a couple of terms and look at the input process. Now, to put the audio editor back into its original position, I'm just going to double-click on that header. It's going to jump back into the default configuration. And when you're first starting out with Wavelab, the two terms that can cause some head-scratching are audio editor versus audio montage. Again, the terminology doesn't seem to be all that different. The key difference here is that, and this is complicated by the fact that the interface windows look fairly similar. But in the audio editor, you're making sonic adjustments to one file at a time. Now you have the two windows so that you can see it, as we've discussed, in different views. But you're really only working with one track, whether that's a stereo track or a mono track, and you're working on one file at a time. As opposed to the audio montage, which, as you can see a little more clearly in this view, you've got lots of different tracks, or lots of different pieces of audio that you're assembling into a group. So if you think in the terms or the context of a CD project, the audio editor is where you would go in and make any final tweaks to each individual song. Then you would drag all those into the audio montage in order to move them around, put them in the right order, and burn them to a CD. And I would say that with that example, CDs tend to be a very linear project. This is sort of what your montage would look like. You would have typically a stereo track that went start to finish with a group of songs. But if you click on the track number over here, in this case 1, this window is going to open up this context menu. And you can actually come in here and add more tracks. There's another stereo track. Maybe I want to come in and add a mono track. And the this gives you the ability to work in a little different methodology here. And depending on what you're doing, if you have a mix of mono and stereo material, maybe you're doing you're putting together soundtrack for a piece of film or video where you've got a couple of mono tracks for narration or sound effects, and then you've got stereo tracks for music and so on. You have the ability to add up to 8 tracks here. And this is the same dialogue that you would use to duplicate or remove and so forth. And we'll get into more detail on this when we get to the audio montage section. But I want you to just get a sense of how that functions. Now, the next big question that you have is, how do I get material into Wavelab if I'm a new user starting out? And if you come to the default tabs at the top and go over to either File Browser or Project Manager, that's going to let you access audio on your hard drive system. The Project Manager tab is optimized to show you stuff that's already been pulled into your project. So here you're seeing all the little bits and pieces that are scattered through these different tab groups we've been looking at. And if you come to the File Browser, that's going to move you all the way up to your navigating around your basic hard drive and so forth. So if we come down to the audio folder for this project, for example, now we can see some raw waveforms there. And it's just a simple question of clicking and dragging those down to wherever you want them in your project. Okay, and that's the wrong format. Let me bring that to a mono track, see if that works better. There we go. So that's one way to get material in. And this same basic workflow over here in the audio editor, you can go back to your file browser. You can drag stuff right into there as well. But the other thing that I want to look at here is the recording function. So in the audio montage and the audio editor, if you look at the transport bottom panel at the bottom here, you have a record button. And you'll notice that in a lot of your other stuff, like the batch process, it's grayed out. You can't record directly into a batch process, or if we come over to the CD, you can play it and stop it, but you can't record. But the audio montage and the audio editor do allow for the direct recording of audio. But what's a little bit different here is when you click that, it's not going to record. Let me go to the montage. Let me select this track 4 down here, and I'm going to hit record. And instead of activating the transport, it's going to call up the recording dialog. And this is universal. Anytime you're executing a record function in Wavelab, you're going to see this interface pop up. And you can see it's registering the mic that I'm using right now, and it's giving you level and pan information. It's got 3 tabs at the top where you can go in and set up your various values for thresholds and durations and file size maxes and things of that nature. Options to how this actual window is going to behave. And then in the method of recording, it's going to ask you, are we making a temporary file? Do you want to give it a name? Where do you want to put it? How many tracks? This center dialog is probably the most key. It's asking you, where do you want the audio stream recorded from? And in this case, we'll pick the audio input hardware, which is the interface we set up in Chapter 1. And you can see that it's working because it's metering here and so forth. It's worth taking a look at some of the options over here for splitting and stopping if there's silence and so on and so forth, especially if you're doing narration for something that ends up as a podcast or a CD. It'll automatically put markers in every time you pause. So as you're reading your script, you can just pause for a moment or two, and you can set how long you want it to wait before it says, oh, he's pausing on purpose. And then it'll split it. It'll put silence in there. It'll put cue points. And essentially, as the operator or the performer, you can just keep reading. And when you're done, your audio file has a whole bunch of that other administrative stuff already applied to it. It takes a little bit of practice to get good at that, but once you get your workflow down, that can be a huge time saver. So then once we have all of this set, the other primary, besides your input, is the location. What are we going to do with this recording? And we can create a new audio file window somewhere. You could add what we're recording to the active editor file, or we're going to take this option to add it to the selected track of this montage. So I've gone down here and I've selected track 4. And with all of this done, when I hit record, we're actually going to take off and capture some audio here. The whole thing will turn red to tell you that you're active. And here we are doing our recording. But this is a little bit different than what you see in most recording applications, because you'll notice the transport bar down here isn't moving. You're not seeing the cursor roll. We're using this sort of floating interface on top of Wavelab to do it. And it just, the first few times you do this, it's a little counterintuitive because nothing else I've ever worked with handles audio recording this way. But as we're rolling along here, you'll see the recorded time scrolling up, and it's giving you a real-time readout of how many megabytes you're taking in and what your disk capacity is and so forth. And you even have the option here to drop in markers in real time if you're acting more as an engineer for somebody else who's recording, say, in a booth, and you want to catch stuff as you're going along. And when you get done, you can hit stop, and there you can see our new track inserted down on the track 4 of the montage there. So that's the basic workflow to actually record audio into a Wavelab. It's a little different. It's a fantastically capable tool. It lets you do stuff that no other recording transport I've ever worked with allows you to do. But it's a little bit hard to find your way around just, again, by pointing and clicking and trial and error. Okay, the last thing for this chapter is I want to go just briefly over some of the zooming tools and window handling and so forth. And a lot of this is pretty intuitive. You've got your standard array of scroll bars and so forth. But notice that the ends of them are hotspots, and you can use those to control the zoom level both horizontally and vertically. Then you have some zoom presets down here that'll snap the display to the either the length of what you're working on or some variable thereof, some multiple thereof. Come back to the audio editor, you'll see that you still have the wheels to zoom up and down, and you still have the scroll bars with the hotspots on them. But the zoom presets based on selected audio drop off. But that stuff's all pretty straightforward. The biggest innovation here in version 9 is tab and window handling. So the tabs that you see in the default view up here are just what Steinberg picked out as the most likely to be the most usable. But you can click them and drag them around to whatever configuration that you need. And if you decide that you would like something like, say, your spectroscope here elsewhere, you can click and hold the tab and drag it out of that window. And when you do, you're going to see hotspots appear all over the place. And hover your mouse over that hotspot, and you'll see a magenta or a purple call out that's going to tell you where the window will be docked. So the first thing I'll point out is if you want to put it back where it was in that tab group, you hover over the folder in the middle, the entire window turns purple, and it's going to pop back in, and then you can move it where you want. That one's a little different than the others because everywhere else you're moving the mouse to where it's going to eventually end up, like that, for example. That was a bad first example. We'll come back to that in a moment. But with putting it back in its original window, you've got to move the mouse to the center of that sort of compass to get it back in the window. So let's take the spectrometer out here, and we can dock it to one of the yellow tabs or to one of the purple tabs. And the difference is that the yellow tab is going to be always in view, and the purple tabs are going to make it a flyout tab. So if we drop it here, now the spectrometer is going to be across the entire top of that waveform, or that window, excuse me. If we drop it over here, it's going to insert itself to the right-hand side and so forth. But if we find a purple tab, we'll take that one I used before on the right-hand side, and we drop it there, you'll notice it slides into the frame of Wavelab. And if you hover over it, then it pops out to show you what you need, and you move off it, and it goes away. And you've got a couple, like the bit meter here, that are defaulted in there, as well as you've got we're not in a mode that can use it, but the plug-in window is over there as well. So depending on how you want to manage and clean up your workspace, you can take any of your various tabs and then put them really wherever you want them. You can open the window control tool in the corner, and you can put it back where it was. You can float it out on its own. You can close it up entirely. So those are the fundamentals of the tab and window handling. And as we get into these the control windows, you'll see that you can use those. You can create control windows, then load them up with just the stuff you want, and then go park them on a separate monitor. Really a lot of flexibility to see what's going on. But that's it for this chapter. We'll come back here in just a moment and look at how to start moving stuff around within those windows.